Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The rain was falling in a steady drizzle as I sat in my car, watching the small cafe where Lucy and I had shared countless dinners over the years. This place held so many memories, late-night conversations about our future, laughter that echoed through the quiet neighborhood, and simple silences where her hand rested warmly in mine. Today, though, I felt like an intruder in my own life, a stranger on the outside looking into someone else's love story. I'd found myself questioning everything recently, each glance she spared me seemed absent, and every touch felt distant. It wasn't anything overt, nothing you could point to and say, "That's it, that's the sign." But I'd known Lucy for years, knew her like I knew myself, and something was different. I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself it was stress or maybe the quiet lull that settled into long marriages. After all, our 2 kids kept her busy, and work had been overwhelming for both of us lately. Still, there were little things I couldn't ignore. One night, after tucking the kids into bed, I found her phone on the kitchen counter, buzzing softly with notifications. I had no real reason to look, it was a private thing, and we trusted each other. But curiosity mixed with the gnawing unease had me picking it up. The name on the screen wasn't familiar. Richard. It was a casual message, but somehow too comfortable, too familiar. I glanced up, feeling like an intruder in my own home. I put the phone back down quickly, convincing myself it was nothing. It was just a work contact. I shook it off and went to bed, pretending everything was normal. But days later, when I went to grab her keys from her purse, I found it. A receipt, tucked carelessly in a side pocket, a receipt for a hotel stay at a place she'd never mentioned. My pulse quickened, and I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Lucy, always so organized, never let anything slip. If it was work-related, she would have told me about it. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the receipt, feeling the fabric of our life together start to unravel. Dinner that night was quiet. Lucy's chatter sounded hollow to me, her laughter forced. Every smile she gave me seemed contrived, a thin veneer hiding something I was starting to fear more and more. I slid the receipt across the table, trying to stay calm. "Lucy," I said, watching her face closely. "I found this." Her eyes fell to the piece of paper, and for a moment, I thought she might actually be honest. But then, she schooled her features, a mask slipping effortlessly into place. "Oh," she said, her voice level, but I could see her hands tremble slightly. "That's just a work thing." She looked up at me with a weak smile. "You know how it is with clients. Sometimes we need to entertain." My heart sank. "Entertain?" I echoed, the bitterness creeping into my voice. "Is that all it was?" Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I watched her struggle for an answer, but nothing came. I'd been expecting some kind of defense, some excuse, but all I got was her silence. It was all I needed to confirm what I'd suspected. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how our marriage had gotten to this point, how Lucy, the woman I'd loved and built a life with, could betray me. But by the early hours of the morning, my hurt had hardened into something cold and unyielding. This wasn't going to end with pleas and apologies, I needed something more, something that would make her understand the depth of her betrayal. In the days that followed, I watched her carefully, each gesture and glance now tinged with suspicion. I went through our old photos, our anniversary cards, the little notes we'd left each other over the years. Each one felt like a mockery, a reminder of the love I'd thought was unbreakable. I started to realize just how much of our life together had become an illusion, something she'd been faking while I'd been pouring everything I had into us. Then I did something I never thought I would do, I started to gather evidence. For the first time in our marriage, I felt the urge to uncover the truth no matter what it cost. I called in a favor with a tech-savvy friend and synced our phones. I told myself it was, for security purposes, but we both knew it was a lie. Each time her phone buzzed, I got the alert. And each time, my heart ached a little more as I pieced together what was happening. It was worse than I'd imagined. Richard wasn't just a name, he was a presence in her life, someone she texted during lunch breaks, someone she confided in. The messages started innocently enough, but soon they became filled with flirtation, laced with an intimacy I hadn't felt with her in years. They'd arranged meetings, late-night hotel visits, stolen moments during her so-called work trips. The threads of our life together unraveled before my eyes, each message shredding another memory we'd made. But I stayed quiet, biding my time, letting the anger simmer beneath my calm exterior. I kept up appearances, kissed her goodbye in the morning, and laughed when she shared stories about her day. But inside, I was hollow, a shell of the man I'd been, fueled only by the plan that was taking shape in my mind. Finally, I knew I had enough. I printed out every message, every call log, every piece of evidence I could find. I stacked them neatly, creating a record of her betrayal, something tangible she couldn't deny. That evening, I waited until the kids were asleep, my heart thundering in my chest as I sat in the living room, my calm composure a thin mask hiding the storm within. When Lucy walked in, I didn't say a word. I didn't yell or accuse, I simply slid the folder across the table. She looked at it, confusion clouding her face, but as she opened it, I saw her expression change. Her face drained of color, and she seemed to shrink before my eyes. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but I'd heard enough lies. The years of trust, of shared dreams and whispered promises, all felt like ash in my mouth. I stood up, feeling the weight of her betrayal sink in. She began to cry, pleading for forgiveness, her words coming in choked gasps. But I had nothing left to give her. I told her I was leaving. For once, her words fell on deaf ears. I'd given her everything, and now, as I walked out that door, I felt nothing but a cold, hollow sense of justice. She would feel what it was like to lose everything, just as she'd taken everything from me. In the days that followed, the house felt like a hollow echo of what it once had been. I stayed in the guest room, a decision Lucy didn't question, though her eyes followed me with a nervous vigilance. She barely spoke, either out of shame or fear, I couldn't tell. She hovered around the kids like a ghost, fixing breakfast and pretending things were normal. I could feel her trying to reach out, but her attempts were weak, overshadowed by the weight of our broken trust. I barely looked at her. The sight of her, someone I'd once loved so deeply, who had now become a stranger, made my stomach turn. My anger was no longer the firestorm it had been the night I confronted her. Instead, it simmered quietly, biding its time, waiting for the right moment. I was methodical. It was something I'd learned in my work in tech: when emotions run high, wait, plan, and act with precision. I spent hours on my laptop late into the night, delving into every detail of Lucy's interactions with Richard. Each message, each intimate exchange was another cut, but I absorbed them in silence. I needed to know everything if I was going to make her feel the depth of what she'd done. One evening, I watched her as she sat on the couch across from me. She seemed smaller somehow, like a shadow of the woman I'd married, her posture slouched, her eyes tired. In some twisted way, I knew she must feel the weight of what she'd done, but it didn't soften my resolve. If anything, her discomfort was a balm for the anger that roared within me. When she finally dared to look up, her voice was low, almost pleading. "Are we ever going to talk about this, Aaron?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. I took a moment, letting her words hang in the air. "What's there to talk about?" I replied, my voice cold, distant. "You made your choices." She opened her mouth to argue but closed it again, defeated. There were so many things she could have said, but none of them would have mattered. Words were meaningless now, just empty sounds that couldn't undo the hurt, the betrayal. As the days stretched on, I went about my life, handling work, taking care of the kids, and doing my best to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I didn't want the kids to feel the fracture growing in our home. They were too young to understand, and part of me resented Lucy even more for bringing this poison into their lives. Our son, Ben, had recently turned 7, and our daughter, Grace, was only 5. They sensed something was wrong, though, and often asked if everything was okay. I'd smile, assure them everything was fine, and change the subject, but their worried eyes lingered on me as they tried to make sense of the strained silence between their parents. I could tell Lucy's guilt was eating away at her. She was beginning to fall apart in small ways, unable to keep up the facade. She'd start tasks around the house but never finish them, leaving half-folded laundry in the living room or dinner halfway prepared. She looked like she was always on the verge of tears, and her once carefully put-together appearance started to fray at the edges. She stopped wearing the jewelry I'd bought her over the years, as if even that simple act of adornment was too much for her to bear. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I found her in the kitchen, staring into a cup of cold tea. The silence was thick, tense, but she looked up as I entered, her expression one of desperation. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and for the first time, I could see how deeply her guilt had cut her. Yet, that flicker of remorse only fueled my resolve further. "Aaron, I know you're hurt, and I know I've made mistakes," she began, her voice trembling. "But can we try to fix this?" I wanted to laugh, the audacity of her words almost too much to bear. "You think this is something you can just fix?" I said, the bitterness clear in my voice. "Like it's a broken dish you can glue back together?" Her face crumpled, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Any sympathy I might have had for her had been burned away by the image of her lying, deceiving me, sneaking around behind my back. It was a dark, unyielding part of me, one I barely recognized, but I let it take hold. "I just want to make things right, Aaron," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned forward, my tone calm but cutting. "You threw away everything we had, Lucy. And now you want to make things right? You should have thought about that before you decided to sleep with him." She flinched as if I'd slapped her, the pain in her eyes clear. But I didn't soften. I needed her to understand that there would be no easy forgiveness, no gentle absolution. For weeks, I went on like this, cold and detached, treating her like a stranger in our own home. I watched her struggle, her attempts to apologize, to make up for what she'd done, only deepening my sense of betrayal. But there was a part of me that knew I couldn't keep living in this purgatory of resentment forever. The rage that had once given me purpose was starting to feel heavy, exhausting, as if it were leaching the life out of me. And then one day, an idea struck me. It was brutal, a dark thought that slithered into my mind and refused to leave. I'd make her suffer, yes, but in a way that was subtle, slow, something that would eat away at her the way her betrayal had eaten away at me. It was time to reclaim my power, to show her just how deeply she'd wounded me by turning her own betrayal against her. The next morning, I started to put my plan into motion. I began by treating her differently, a hint of kindness in my tone, a softening of the tension between us. Lucy noticed the change immediately, her relief palpable, and she began to think I was ready to forgive her. She started smiling again, tentative, almost afraid it was too good to be true. I offered small gestures of affection, a hand on her shoulder, a quick kiss on the cheek before work, things that gave her hope. She didn't realize that every gesture was part of a carefully calculated plan, a way to keep her guessing, to make her wonder if she'd finally won me back. And in those moments when she felt secure, when she thought we were healing, I'd withdraw again, leaving her confused and desperate. It was a dance of push and pull, a twisted game of emotional whiplash that kept her on edge. She began confiding in her friends about our reconciliation, telling them how hard she was working to make things right, how she was committed to winning me back. But behind her smile, I could see the growing desperation, the sense of never quite knowing where she stood. I became the specter of her guilt, haunting her in ways she could never escape. By the end of the month, Lucy was a shell of the confident woman she once was. I could see the cracks in her facade, the exhaustion and despair she tried so hard to hide. And in a strange, twisted way, I felt satisfied. The scales had tipped in my favor, and for the first time since the betrayal, I felt a sliver of peace. But the emptiness remained, a hollow ache that no amount of revenge could fill. The house had settled into a strange rhythm, a cold routine where each day blurred into the next. My plan was unfolding exactly as I'd envisioned. Lucy continued to hover, her uncertainty evident in every word, every movement. She was trying so hard to read me, to gauge my mood, desperate for any hint that she might be winning back my trust. She had no idea she was dancing to the tune of a revenge that I had orchestrated, one that cut her deeper each time she thought she was safe. After a month of this psychological game, I started to lay the groundwork for the next phase. I knew it had to be subtle, a slow burn that would remind her of everything she had jeopardized. It wasn't enough to see her regret, I wanted her to feel the loss inch by inch. One evening, as she sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine, I joined her, slipping into the seat beside her. She looked up, surprised, her face lighting up with a flicker of hope. "I was thinking," I said, keeping my tone light, "about us. About moving forward." Her eyes widened, and she nodded, eager, her hand reaching for mine. "Whatever it takes, Aaron," she whispered. "I just want us to be okay." I took a breath, letting her believe I was hesitant, weighing my words carefully. Maybe we should spend some time apart. Just a little break. Time to think." Her face fell, the shock clear in her wide eyes. She opened her mouth to protest, but I raised a hand, stopping her. "It doesn't mean I'm giving up," I said softly. I need to clear my head. This is all so much to take in. You understand, right?" She looked down, her grip tightening around my hand, her fingers cold. "Of course," she murmured, her voice shaky. "Whatever you need." I almost felt sorry for her as she nodded, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I knew she'd take the suggestion to heart, that she'd see it as her punishment and cling to it as a chance to prove herself. She spent the next week arranging everything, researching places for me to stay, making calls, even packing a small bag for me. It was almost pathetic to watch her try to make it right in every little way. But she didn't see the small smile that played on my lips as I took the bag from her hands, gently brushing her cheek as I said goodbye. Once I left, I settled into a nearby motel, a simple, unassuming place with no frills, and set up my laptop on the small desk. It was time to watch my plan reach its full effect. I'd installed a few subtle tracking apps on her phone, giving me access to her location, her calls, even her text messages. It was something I'd done quietly over the past month while she was at work or occupied with the kids. The guilt of snooping felt distant, drowned out by the need for clarity, for control over the pieces she'd shattered. It was a few days later when I saw the first signs of her unraveling. Her texts to friends were frantic, filled with self-blame, begging for advice. She was trying to keep it together for the kids, but I could sense her desperation, the growing fear that this break might lead to something more final. And her friends, of course, had no idea how to comfort her. They offered platitudes, empty words that only fueled her anxiety. She was alone in this, as I'd planned. During one of these nights, I watched as she texted me. The messages started simple, reaching out in a calm, respectful tone. But over the hours, as I left her on read, her words began to break down, becoming frantic, emotional. "Aaron, please just tell me you're okay. I'm so sorry. I don't know what else I can do. Please answer me." Her messages turned into paragraphs, texts pleading for me to let her see me, to talk to me, to at least tell her that this wasn't the end. I let them pile up, unread and unanswered. The silence was part of the plan, a silence that would drive her to a place she had never known. And each unread message was a small victory, a reminder that I was the one in control now. Days passed, and finally, I decided it was time to break the silence. I called her on a Sunday evening, letting her voice ring in my ears, raw with worry. She answered on the first ring, her relief almost palpable. "Aaron," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and hope. I've been so worried. Why didn't you answer my messages?" "I needed time to think," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, calm. "It's not easy for me either, Lucy." "I know," she stammered. I want to make this right. I'll do anything, Aaron, anything. Just, don't give up on us." I took a moment, letting her words sink in, and then sighed. "Meet me tomorrow," I said. "Let's talk." The next evening, I found myself back in our neighborhood, watching her as she approached the small cafe we'd once frequented. She looked thinner, her face pale, her movements stiff, almost tentative. She spotted me at a table in the corner and quickly made her way over, her eyes scanning my face, searching for any hint of forgiveness. We ordered coffee, neither of us really touching it, the cups cooling as the silence between us stretched thin. Finally, I leaned forward, my eyes meeting hers. "Why did you do it, Lucy?" I asked, my voice low, almost gentle. "Why him? Why put us through this?" Her face crumpled, the tears already spilling over as she reached for my hand. I don't know, Aaron. I was lonely. I thought I wanted something else. Something new. But it was a mistake, a horrible mistake." She looked away, ashamed, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. "I've hated myself every day since. I never meant to hurt you, or the kids. I was stupid, selfish. I don't know what came over me." I nodded, absorbing her words. They were what I expected, the empty apologies of someone who had lost control, someone who thought only of themselves. I watched her crumble, her walls breaking down, and felt the satisfaction I'd been waiting for. But then a strange feeling crept in, something unexpected, a flicker of pity, a glimpse of the woman I'd once loved buried beneath the guilt and regret. She reached out, her hand trembling, her gaze imploring. "Aaron, please. Give me a chance to make it right. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Just, please." I wanted to hate her, to keep that anger alive, but as I looked at her, I felt the exhaustion of it all, the weight of the plan I'd carefully crafted starting to press down on me. I wasn't sure what I'd expected to find in this moment. Satisfaction? Justice? All I felt was an empty victory, a sense of hollowness that even her tears couldn't fill. "Lucy," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. I don't know if I want to." She looked as though I'd slapped her, the shock and devastation clear on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, only a choked sob as she buried her face in her hands. I stood up, the noise of the cafe fading as I turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the weight of her choices. As I stepped into the cool evening air, I felt the last remnants of my anger dissolve, leaving only a strange, numb calm. For so long, I'd clung to the idea of making her suffer, of giving her a taste of the pain she'd caused me. But now that it was done, there was no satisfaction, no sense of closure. Only the stark realization that even revenge couldn't fix what was broken. The streets were quiet as I walked back to my car, each step echoing the emptiness inside me. In that moment, I knew that I'd reached the end of my plan, but it hadn't brought the peace I'd imagined. Lucy was shattered, left to confront the ruins of what she destroyed, but I felt no joy in it, no sense of victory. The betrayal, the anger, the need for revenge, they were all fading, leaving behind a hollow ache, a reminder of what we'd both lost. The house was quiet, steeped in an eerie calm that felt foreign and unsettling. After that last meeting with Lucy, I hadn't heard from her for days. The silence that had once felt like control now left an emptiness I couldn't shake, like I was caught in a strange, hollow limbo between anger and regret. On the 5th night of that silence, my phone rang. It was Lucy's sister, Julia, and something in her tone when she said, "Aaron, "You need to come over," sent a chill down my spine. When I pulled into Lucy's driveway, the lights were dimmed, and the house looked as empty as I felt. Julia opened the door, her face pale, lips pressed tight as if fighting to hold back tears. She led me inside without a word, past the hallway and into the living room where Lucy sat on the couch, a thick envelope clutched in her hands. Her eyes, usually so vibrant, were dull, her gaze unfocused. She didn't look up as I entered, but her fingers tightened around the envelope. Julia gave me a slight nod, then turned and left the room, her footsteps fading up the stairs. I was alone with Lucy now, the silence stretching, thick and heavy. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask her why I'd been called here, but before I could get a word out, she held the envelope out to me. "What is this?" I asked, not reaching for it, a sinking feeling clawing at my stomach. "Read it," she whispered, her voice breaking, the words barely escaping her lips. I took the envelope, feeling its weight, and sat down in the armchair across from her. Slowly, I pulled the contents out, a series of letters and notes in Lucy's handwriting, some of them old, faded at the edges, others newer, written on clean, stark paper. The first one read, "Aaron, if you're reading this, then you should know the truth." I swallowed hard and continued, my heart sinking as I realized what I was reading. She had started writing these letters months before the affair began, chronicling a quiet, desperate pain I hadn't seen, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. She wrote about feeling lost, of watching her life spiral into something she couldn't control. There were pages of self-doubt, loneliness, and resentment. And then I came to a letter dated just a month before she'd met Richard. "I don't know if you see it, Aaron, but I'm not the same. I feel like I'm losing myself, and you don't even notice. I wish you'd notice." I stopped reading, the weight of her words pressing down on me. She'd felt invisible, unheard, and while it didn't excuse what she'd done, it painted a picture I hadn't allowed myself to see. I thought back to the months before the affair, to the nights I'd stayed late at work, the weekends I'd spent preoccupied with projects. I thought I was providing for our family, doing what I was supposed to. But in doing so, I'd let her slip away, ignoring the small cries for help until she'd gone somewhere else to find what she felt she'd lost. My hands shook as I picked up the next letter, written in trembling, hurried handwriting. "After all of this, I'm just empty. I don't deserve forgiveness, and I know I've shattered what we had. But I can't keep living with the weight of it. I'm sorry, Aaron. I can't make up for what I've done, but I need you to know I never stopped loving you, even when I didn't know how to show it." I looked up at her, my throat tight. "Lucy, what is this?" She met my gaze, tears filling her eyes. "It's everything I should have told you before. But now, it's too late." I tried to speak, to tell her that maybe it wasn't too late, that we could still try to make things right, but she shook her head slowly. "No, Aaron. I've already hurt you enough. I can't keep pretending I'll ever be able to fix this." Her voice cracked, and she looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. I was struck by a sudden, crushing guilt, an understanding of the pain we had both inflicted on each other. All those months of holding on to my anger, clinging to the need for revenge, I'd never once asked myself if she had been suffering too. I'd assumed her betrayal was heartless, selfish, but I was only seeing the result of a heartbreak that had been brewing long before Richard came into our lives. And now, as she sat there, broken and defeated, I realized I'd been so focused on making her feel the hurt she caused that I'd ignored the hurt she carried herself. "Lucy," I began, but she interrupted me, her voice soft, almost hollow. "Aaron, I'm leaving," she said, her words quiet, final. "I'm going away for a while. I don't know where, but I need to get away from everything, from here, from this house, from all of it. I need to find something. Maybe myself." The ache in her voice was almost unbearable. I tried to reach for her hand, to bridge the chasm between us, but she pulled away, shaking her head. "Don't, Aaron," she whispered. "Please don't. You wanted your revenge, and you got it. You've broken me. And I deserved it. I felt my heart splinter as she stood, grabbing a small bag from beside the couch. She walked past me, her footsteps heavy, and I followed her to the door, desperate, words failing me. But before she opened it, she turned to look at me one last time, her expression a mixture of regret and resignation. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I loved you, Aaron. I always did. And I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to make you believe it." And then she was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving me standing alone, the silence of the empty house pressing in around me. I waited, hoping she'd turn back, that the door would open and she'd come rushing back to tell me she'd stay. But the minutes stretched into hours, and the house remained empty. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing from her. The weight of my anger was replaced by a deep, gnawing sorrow, a hollow ache that lingered long after I thought it would. I replayed our last conversation in my head, wondering if I could have said something different, done something to stop her from leaving. But I knew the answer. She was gone, and I was the one who had pushed her there, too blinded by my own hurt to see the pieces of herself she had tried so hard to share with me. One evening, as I went through the house, trying to clean up the remnants of our life together, I found her final letter, the one she must have written just before she left. It was short, only a few lines, but it hit me harder than anything else she'd left behind. "Aaron, if you ever read this, know that I loved you until the end. And maybe someday, in a different life, we'll find each other again, in a place where forgiveness comes easier, where love doesn't get tangled in pain. Until then, take care of our children, and take care of yourself. I'll carry you with me, always." And in that moment, as the words blurred through my tears, I realized that no revenge, no punishment could ever give me back what I had lost. I had won the war I'd waged against her betrayal, but the victory felt as empty as the house around me. For the rest of my life, I would carry the weight of that hollow win, a reminder that, in trying to destroy her, I'd only managed to destroy myself.